困难和挑战进一步告诉我们
To break through the mist and embrace a bright future, the most powerful strength comes from cooperation and concerted efforts, and the most effective way is to work together in solidarity.
Chinese President Xi Jinping addressing the Boao Forum for Asia in Hainan. Hello, I'm Anton Fedyashin, and this is The Heat. The annual BFA conference is well underway with over 600 delegates from 42 countries and regions in attendance. This year's theme is The World in COVID-19 and Beyond, Working Together for Global Development and a Shared Future. President Xi Jinping, in his speech, stressed the importance of multilateralism in facing some of the world's toughest issues. CGTN's Dong Xu reports from Boao.
尊敬的各位国际组织负责人
Chinese President Xi Jinping says China will continue to push for multilateralism and peaceful cooperation among Asian countries. Delivering the opening remarks via video link, this is President Xi's sixth address at the annual Boao Forum for Asia series. President Xi says the world is still facing uncertainties brought by the COVID-19 pandemic and that more than ever we must work together. China has provided more than 2 billion doses of vaccines to more than 120 countries and regions, and Xi says China will keep doing so to narrow the immunization gap. He also says China is committed to furthering opening up, boosting economic recovery, and promoting Asian unity.
合理安全关切
President Xi stresses that security is a prerequisite for development, and humankind is an indivisible community of security, and that a Cold War mentality can only undermine the framework of global peace. The president says hegemonism and power politics can only harm world peace, and that confrontation among blocs can only exacerbate 21st century security challenges. To contribute, Xi says China is ready to put forward global security initiatives, jointly safeguard world peace, respect the territorial integrity of all countries, and uphold the UN's opposition to unilateralism through dialogue and consultation. He says China opposes unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. Discussions at the forum encompass topics from digital currencies, carbon neutrality, as well as the economic outlook for a post-pandemic world. Billed as the Asian version of the World Economic Forum, the event has become an increasingly influential platform to witness China's opening up, integration to Asia, as well as the global community. Dong Xue, CGTN, Boao, Hainan Province.
To discuss the forum and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Sourabh Gupta is the Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-American Studies. Also in the U.S. Capitol is Anton Fedyashin. He is a professor of history at American University and author of Liberals Under Autocracy. Out of Portland, Oregon, Liang is the Endowed Chair and Professor of Economics at Willamette University. And from Beijing, China, Einar Tangen joins us. He is a political and economic affairs commentator. Welcome to all of you. Einar Tangen, President Xi brought up several issues at the Boao Forum, one of them being global security, as we just heard in our report there. He is proposing a global security initiative. What can you tell us about this initiative and how it would work?
Well, I don't have any inside information, but if you follow the logic of his speech, it was quite clear. He was laying out a structure. First, he was talking about the global issues, pandemic, security, and of course, economics. And then he went on to the regional issues that affect the countries that are around the Boao Forum. So, you know, as I said, from the logic of it, it seems that he is going to, in essence, propose something that includes the UN and the principles of the UN, but goes outside it. There's obviously a deadlock at the Security Council. And in order to get past this, it's going to be have to be some sort of conclave of powers. And I believe that would be China, India, obviously Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and the European powers. The one to watch is the Europeans, because they're very anxious to achieve some sort of peace. Right now, things are a deadlock. Everyone's throwing each other's diplomats out. The talking has, in essence, stopped. And I think that's what Xi wants to do. He needs a different kind of platform in order to bring about some sort of resolution involving the most affected parties.
Anna, just one other point, and you mentioned it, it's the pandemic. In fact, the theme of this year's forum is the world in COVID-19 and beyond, working together for global development in a shared future. And it's taking place against the background of an escalation in the number of cases in China right now. So how is that being seen in the country in terms of the goals that the forum wants to achieve?
Well, I mean, in terms of China is not necessarily revolutionary speeches, despite the past. It's all about evolution. And right now, I mean, it's the security situation vis-a-vis not only COVID, but also the Ukrainian situation is what is uppermost in people's minds. In terms of internally within China, there is concern about what's going on. But I think a lot of people look at different cities, not just Shanghai, and how it's been handled there. And I think there was a sense from at least the people that I've talked to that initially Shanghai was not, it was not a model response, dividing the city in two and hoping that it would go away. The pandemic response was not quick enough, nor were the leaders decisive enough. Now, it could be they were unlucky. This is a virus that evolves, and you have to evolve your responses to it. But at least right now, people are not satisfied with what happened early on, and there have been a number of moves by the Chinese government very swiftly to bring in outside leadership to take control of the situation. But it's not been smooth. Things are going down in terms of the numbers, but this is a situation where China cannot afford to have the pandemic get out of control, because what you have in Shanghai, it will not be repeated in other cities. If you look at how Shenzhen responded, quite different.
Sourabh Gupta, the president, talked about global security, but he also focused on regional security, about security in Asia. He underscored the importance of regional peace and promoting unity. Yet, if we look at Asia right now, we see that in some countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan, there's instability right now. You've got the United States, which is planning on deploying a series of missile bases along what's called the first island chain. So looking at all those things, what would a security initiative for Asia look like?
I thought one of the most innovative parts of his speech was his focus on Asia, where he essentially said that it's time for Asia to lead. Just because he said time for Asia to lead, it doesn't mean it's for Asians necessarily to lead. He kept it open. Outsiders can play an important role in the development of Asian security. But I think what he was also flagging was the fact that we have now in the last 25 years seen two major wars on the European continent. And in the post-11 age, we saw numerous wars, and we know how they turned out to be. And frankly, the Euro-Atlantic world to some extent has forfeited its right to determine how security architectures should be drawn up. And in this context, I think he talked about Asia coming together both economically and politically and devising arrangements which are open, comprehensive, and cooperative. And yes, the point is correct that in pockets of Asia, as you talked about in Afghanistan, Pakistan, tremendous instability and no easy solutions there. And of course, there is the great power competition, major power competition happening in the Indo-Pacific. But what we also need to be very clear about is that in the last 40 years of reform that China has engineered, about 150 people only, 150 soldiers only have lost their lives during this period. I think it's a tremendous record. And so long as Asia can keep growing economically and becoming prosperous, I do not see that Asia necessarily needs to go down the route that Europe has gone down, and that Asia can remain secure and prosperous, and its security arrangements can be fairly encompassing.
Sourabh, when you say it's time for Europe and North America to relinquish their right to determine the international security architecture, are we then looking at some kind of alternative? Is this what the Global Security Initiative is about? We have to remember that the current security architecture, or the international rules-based order that we now talk about, was put in place after World War II. The world has changed considerably since then.
Yes and no, because what President Xi was alluding to was not something as dramatic or drastic as that. When he talked about the Global Security Initiative, he was trying to reframe and center that once again in UN Charter principles, as well as 5 principles of peaceful cooperation principles. And so that's what he was alluding to. But in the course of the points he made, he was very clear. He talked about countries being passengers on a ship where we are all bound together, and on that ship we need to resolve our problems. We don't toss passengers overboard. And I think he was alluding to the fact that some people are talking about excluding Russia from this forum and that forum. Imagine a P5 country and a $1 trillion plus economy being put out of the G20 or something like that. It just doesn't make sense. But he was talking in that context that we need to have all-encompassing security, means everybody at the table, no in-groups, out-groups, and excluded players.
Right.
So I think that was the main focus. And thereafter, he talked in terms of Asian leadership and Asia coming together and playing that anchor role for world peace.
Anton Fedyashin, President Xi Jinping also made reference to the current crisis in Ukraine. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Security is the premise for development, and mankind is an inseparable community of security. Facts have once again proved that the Cold War mentality can only wreck the framework of global peace. Hegemony and power politics can only jeopardize world peace, and confrontation can only exacerbate security challenges in the 21st century.
That seemed to have been a reference there, Anton, to NATO, particularly the United States. Does he have a point when he says that NATO, and particularly the United States, still have a Cold War mentality?
He seems to be speaking on really for many people in the global South who have not taken a clear position on the current catastrophe unfolding in Ukraine. And President Xi is certainly not the only one to hold this view. Cyril Ramaphosa, speaking before his parliament on the 17th of March, just a few weeks after the conflict in Ukraine began, said something very similar and essentially repeated that NATO expansion is ultimately created the conditions for the tragedy that's unfolding in Eastern Europe. As we've seen over the past multiple weeks, as my colleague here in Washington said a second ago, from the point of view of the global South, what's going on in Eastern Europe is a Euro-Atlantic crisis, not a global one. And, I think a lot of what I hear from the Chinese over the past several years reminds me very, very much of what Mikhail Gorbachev was saying in front of the UN during that historic speech on the 7th of December of 1988, where he encouraged the whole world to abandon the trap of binarism in international relations, to look to the UN as the place to settle conflicts and disagreements, by the way, debates, and to abandon the idea of camps in the world. And it looks like that baton, after America's unipolar moment, is now passing over to Asia, and we'll see how successful the Asian countries are in fixing what the West has failed to resolve on its own terms.
Is it fair to say then, Anton, that what the Chinese are looking for is for the developing world, the global South, having a bigger voice in world affairs?
Of course. And again, Anand, this is part of a much bigger trend for me as an historian. This is absolutely fascinating to watch because if you trace the history of our planet back about 500 years to the Columbian epoch, the West first Europe, then of course the United States in the 20th century, have set the pace, the tone, the beat of the global music, and the West has really dominated the rest of the world. What happened in Europe, what happened in the United States, or the Soviet Union for that matter, mattered greatly to the rest of the world and affected it, for better and very often for worse. Those days are now coming to an end, and there are new players coming out of the global South, not just out of Asia, of course. They were brought into the era of modern globalization, expecting or rather being expected to play by rules that they did not set. And now they are claiming their right to adjust the rules to reflect their national and even regional interests.
Liang, given the Western response to the crisis in Ukraine, and if we look at the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, there are analysts who feel that the purpose of those sanctions is to destroy the Russian economy, and one of the consequences of that is that it marks the end of globalization. And we know that globalization is something very dear to China and something that it champions. Do you agree with that?
Well, great to talk to you, Anand. So I think, in a way, since the global financial crisis of 2008, we're already seeing some trends of, localizing supply chain and so on. With the COVID and with the geopolitical tensions, I think that trend has been accelerating. It is true now the countries are thinking how to build their supply chain resilience and how to reduce the reliance on, other countries for energy or food and so on and so forth. So in some ways, I think that simply means that the old kinds of globalization as we know it is probably coming to a different new fashion. I still think that there are a lot of value about globalizing, trade, investment, intellectual, exchanges, and so on and so forth. But then I think countries are now also increasingly realizing how food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and technological independence are important. That said, I think there's still a lot of common grounds for global cooperation and collaboration. We all know about climate change. That's a global challenge, and that requires global sort of reactions. And talking about COVID recovery of the economy, that also takes a lot of policy coordinations and also reduce the protectionism sort of tendency. So I agree that globalization is going to be reshaped by a lot of these recent very dramatic shocks. But at the same time, I don't think the sort of cooperations and collaborations between different countries in economic, in security, in politics, in many of the other aspects will simply come to an end.
Just on your point that countries should reduce their dependence on global supply chains, Liang, I mean, can one have global security when countries can have their entire economies destroyed if they don't abide by the Western consensus, which we are seeing?
Well, absolutely not. I think that's very much a rhetorical question, right? So I think definitely countries need to secure and maintain their political economic stability to be able to grow the economy and serve their people. So I think that's why President Xi in his speech he talked about this global security initiative, and some of the panelists already mentioned what it means. We don't have a lot of details, but I think that there are three things that really struck out to me. One is this idea of indivisible, security, that one country's security should not be at the expense of another. And so from there, he calls for, rejecting this Cold War mentality, this group politics, and then the bloc confrontation. And I think he also stressed that for Asia, this is a stabilizing factor, that countries come together, form economic partnership in the form of ASEP, application to the CPTPP, and also the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. And all these Asian countries would work together to improve their market access, cooperations in economic activities. And so I think all of these would mean that Asia would be a stabilizing factor. So that security is absolutely necessary for prosperity.
Einar Tangen, the state of the world economy was also the focus at this forum. In fact, the vice president of the Research Institute of the Boao Forum for Asia told the Global Times, and I'm quoting here, he said, Asia accounts for almost half the world's economic output, and its economic growth is also faster than the rest of the world. With that in mind, given that the supply chain problems that we are seeing right now, given with the rise in inflation in many countries around the world, how important is it for Asian economies to perform when it comes to the future of the international economy?
Well, that's one of the issues here, is that globalization is lacking because they're the instrument of trust. This idea of a framework where countries can trust each other has kind of gone by the wayside. And what Xi wants to do is to institute that, at least in Asia, which is the economic engine and also anchor for the world. He also went into how China would be part of that. You've heard from all of the panelists saying that this is a moment of change. And the question is, how do you achieve that? I do think that the principles of the UN are there, but they're obviously, it's not working. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the kind of situations we have. I mean, you had the G20, you had COP26. There was a lot of, passing the buck along, which has been, the hallmark of a lot of democracies around the world. Rather than dealing with the hard issues, they kind of just say, okay, look, we'll just let the next guy or the next group do it, meaning that no one actually addresses it. So at this juncture, it's not only just half the production of the world, but the major markets, population, it's in the fast approaching point where the GDP of the world is going to be more on the Asian side. I think she believes that there needs, in a multipolar world, there needs to be a framework where they can work together. And as I said, the UN right now is lacking simply because of the deadlock and these ideas that you can defeat your opponent, bludgeon them into some sort of regime change. And that's not going to be productive. It's going to make countries feel more insecure. So he's trying to find ways that they can come together. And I do think that there will be a concrete proposal that gets countries together in some sort of framework, at least to deal with the Ukraine situation, and then other issues, including the economics, which is equally difficult. Remember, it's the reason the global South is rallying around, is looking for something to rally around, is they're the ones who feel that they're going to be punished. 60% of the countries in developing countries are at a point where almost half their government revenues are being used to fund their debt at a time when they can barely afford rising food costs and energy costs.
Right.
This is going to be very difficult.
Sourabh, one of the core components of Chinese foreign policy has been its relationship, its trade and economic relationship with other countries. And we see that, of course, through the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance. What kind of impact has that had on international growth around the world, particularly in developing countries?
Well, I think the Belt and Road has been incredibly facilitative of international growth. We know that there is a paucity of infrastructure financing in many developing countries, and China stepped forward to do that infrastructure financing, because the logic goes that if you provide the infrastructure, it will fire up their economies, and then they can produce goods and hopefully export them out. And frankly, the best way for China to continue down the Belt and Road is, of course, to green it, to make it more greener, particularly in the renewable energy segment, but also to become a big consumer so that the goods that are produced, that are fired up in these developing economies, then can be exported back to China. That is what made America so powerful in the 1940s onwards, in the era after the Second World War.
Right.
And that's exactly what Belt and Road can facilitate once again.
Anton Fedyashin, the crisis in Ukraine, of course, has impacted the supply of energy, oil and gas that comes from Russia. It's also impacted the, I think we have lost Anton Fedyashin. Liang, let me go to you and talk about some of the regional developments in China right now. Oh, we have Anton Fedyashin back. Anton, I was saying that the crisis...
Back. Glitch.
I can hear you, Anton, thanks. The crisis in Ukraine has impacted the supply of energy, oil and gas, for instance. It's also seriously affected the supply of food around the world, which comes from Russia and from Ukraine as well. This is seriously undermining the kind of sustainable future that China has been working for. I mean, do you see that being fixed in the near term?
Only if the geopolitics are fixed. I think, if anything, the current crisis in Ukraine is reminding us all of just how globalized we have become, because here are two countries, Ukraine and Russia, that supply an enormous amount of grain to large parts of Africa and the Middle East and South Asia. And all of these societies are bracing themselves for a very tough year in terms of food prices and food availability. I think the current crisis around Ukraine, and especially the sanctions against Russia, are also a very important reminder of globalization in terms of those sanctions blowback, the boomerang effect on all Western societies, first and foremost the Europeans, but we're also seeing it here in the United States. So geopolitical stability first, and President Xi was right about that, and that will create the conditions for markets to grow.
Liang, one other point. China wants to be part of the CPTPP as well as the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. What impact would that have on Asian markets when China becomes a member?
Right. So I think that takes a lot of commitments for China to reform and open its economy, and that also help to, improve the standardization of these different trade, investment, digital governance practices. So I think with the unified standards and also with the sort of more reform and opening, this would definitely strengthen the economic sort of integration and activities among these Asian economies, and actually beyond Asian economies. For example, the DEPA also includes Chile in that. So I think it will be a great, opportunities for countries to be able to work together. And I just want to briefly comment on sort of this idea of food crises, and also in terms of the emerging markets, which Einar talked about, these debt crises. There has been, accusations about China is not doing enough in the G20 framework. But I think, China has already done a lot in terms of the debt, service suspension initiative, which basically, has suspended their services for very low-income countries in the tune of about 12.9%. China alone contributed about $2.1 billion for debt relief, and that translated into 16%. Now, given the fact that, yes, China is one of the biggest debt creditor to these developing, sub-Saharan African countries, that's why many people said, China is not doing enough, it's not forgiving enough loans. But again, we need to put it in perspective. China is making a lot of efforts in sort of helping to relieve that debt crisis, whereas I think it also takes countries like the United States to think about, the implications of them using the interest rates.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anton Fedyashin in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.